Guys,
Cool.
welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for being here this morning and joining us. My name is Samantha Saki, for those of you who don't know me, and I am the founder of the Self Club. I'm an educator and a strategist, and an entrepreneur. And yeah, the Self Club is basically on a mission to make the world a more self aware, emotionally intelligent, and socially conscious place. Right. And we do it in different shapes and forms. And these kind of, live sessions we've been doing now with online courses, coaching, online experiences, and yeah, blogs, and a lot of content we like to bring to you for all of this stuff that they didn't teach us in school that we think is absolutely essential to be like a healthy, functional human being, right? And today, well, I have Matt with us again for the
Yes,
second
I
time,
am.
and Matt is one of our collaborators, one of our coaches for the Self Club. With the Self Club, we co-create, and he brings such a beautiful and rich perspective. With his background, his experience, and training. So I'll let you quickly introduce yourself, Matt, for those who don't
Yeah,
know you.
cool. So, hey guys, maybe one of the first things to know is that, I work as an emotional intimacy coach. So I really help people to develop that healthy self-esteem that it takes to have healthy relationships, both with yourself and with others. And obviously a major part of that is boundaries. And for me, I would say that, it's an inspirational side of my life, right? Being able to explore this and help people and talk about stuff like this, because it's obviously a journey that I went through myself, of not having very healthy boundaries growing up and not having family that necessarily respected those boundaries as well as they could have done or should have done maybe. And it's become something of an interest for me. And going through the last probably just over 10 years of my life, it's been a focal point for me, learning about emotions and boundaries and how to have a healthy life and good relationships. So something that I'm really cool. And I think would be really cool to discuss and talk with you guys. And maybe we can get to the bottom of a few things.
Let's do a quick recap of what we're talking about today. So today we'll be covering, well, obviously, what boundaries are, right? And
Yeah.
we'll be talking about the types of boundaries, the benefits, like why we should have boundaries in the first place, and what happens, like what does it look like if boundaries are not clear? Okay, and something that I'll be asking you, Matt, is I really want people to take away like, how does it look like, right? Me having a conversation with my partner, with my friend, right, to put those boundaries into place. So hopefully you can
Yeah.
take away like that, how you can do it in a way that feels comfortable, right, for you.
Yeah.
Why
Yeah.
did we choose this like boundaries?
All right. What the fuck's a boundary anyway?
What the fuck is a boundary anyway? And
Yeah.
and one key thing we discussed is that a boundary is that fundamental idea for creating the self, right? And
Yes.
then I love that this has a lot for me to do with like authenticity, like what it means to be you and not somebody else,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Very much so. I mean, if you just imagine if you don't have a differentiation between you and someone else, how do you know what you think and what they think, right? What they feel and what you feel? There has to be that differentiation to say, well, someone else can think something that I don't think, or that they can feel something that I don't feel, which means that they can do something and behave and live a life which is different to the way that I behave and live a life, and that's okay. And if we had to agree on all of those things, right, we would be okay, maybe in union, but it's almost impossible with so many different perspectives on life that we're going to have different views, different ideas, and different opinions on what life should be like. So hence, without that, we kind of get pulled into what the other person believes, what the other person thinks. And this happens a lot, especially in early childhood, right? In our first few years, we're very much enmeshed with our parents, right? With our mother, first of all, right? And that we basically only get to experience what she shows us. And obviously, as we get older and we grow up, we develop more and more boundaries and being able to say no to our parents and to be able to have individual thoughts, ideas, want to become independent. And as we go through that process, we develop healthier boundaries.
I think a lot of people can relate to this, right? Like people, for example, who are overly empathetic and
Yeah,
often take on other people's emotions as if it was their responsibility.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And
yeah.
that's probably one of the major parts of boundaries we'll talk about, which is personal responsibility. Right? Is that one of those is to say that I am unique, right? I am individually as equal as other people. And it's a fundamental point to being able to have this idea of I get to have boundaries. I get to have my own opinions, my own views, my own life, right? Because I'm equally as valuable as anyone else. Right? And it's that, I guess, basis that helps us develop the rest of our, yeah, I would say boundaries. Yeah. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And it's also kind of like knowing what is okay for you, right? Because a lot of, again, if people have, I think that there's a two-way, right? There's boundaries that are not in place. And I just want to give people practical examples they can relate to,
Right.
right? Taking
Yeah.
on other people's emotions or feeling responsible for how somebody else feels.
Yeah.
That is a boundary that is not really
Yeah.
in place, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I would say that you want to look at least within three categories on here. First category is going to be what happens if I don't have healthy boundaries. And that means that I take on the role or the life or the experiences of somebody else as well as my own. Right? So then if someone else is unhappy, I'm unhappy. If they think something, then I have to think that too. And I make myself wrong if I don't, because I've always got a contradiction there going on. That if someone else thinks something and I think I should think what they think, then I have to shut myself down. So then I lose my identity a lot. Right? So that's one of the side effects of having low boundaries, is that we don't have an identity. Right? We don't have a self. We don't really know who we are or where the difference is, which means if our partners comes home and has a bad day and is feeling grumpy, then we're going to get sucked into that. And then we have a grumpy evening because I don't have that boundary to be able to say, well, okay, I can empathize with my partner, but be okay myself. And that sometimes is a sticking point for people who don't have those healthy boundaries. The second one would be, well, what happens if I don't respect other people's boundaries? Meaning I'm very strong in my own and I defend my own boundaries, but yet I cross over other people, which means I'm so rigid in my boundaries that in order to maintain them all the time, I have to cross other people's, right? Because they need to be a certain way so that I can feel comfortable, right? Which is quite often the case. Is like if I want to feel a certain way, or if I'm rigid that I have to feel okay. So as soon as I start to feel afraid or vulnerable, I have to make the other person wrong for what they did so that I can come back to being right. Right? So that's this right wrong idea that if someone else thinks differently to me, they are wrong. Right? In which case, right, that's the rigid boundaries. Right? We cross other people's boundaries to maintain our own.
Okay,
And
I
then
love this. So there's healthy boundaries, which we have not looked at yet, right? And then
right,
there's two types of unhealthy boundaries. There's
yeah,
low boundaries
yeah,
or
yeah,
non-existent,
non-existent, yeah,
which is kind of like, I'm happy if you're happy, right? We can
right,
summarize it like
exactly,
that.
yeah,
Putting other people's needs before yours and
first, yeah,
sacrificing your own needs for
yeah,
other people.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's where we get with like this kind of looking for approval, right?
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. So
very
those are
much
the
so.
low. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I love this because I think actually I've never talked about this much. There's also a kind of boundaries that are unhealthy, which are the rigid,
Hmm.
right? Like rigid.
Yeah.
And that means like I'm inflexible.
Yeah.
This is what I need. And I'm
Yeah.
not willing to shift this one bit. So
Yeah.
you have to change.
Yes.
You have
Yeah.
to sacrifice your needs, right? And that's what I
Very much
expect
so.
from you.
Yeah. And the interesting idea of this and how this develops, both low boundaries and rigid boundaries, is that we were shamed for our identity as we were growing up, or we experienced shame growing up, which meant that we then have to either have rigid boundaries to not feel that again, so that we force other people to accept the way that we are, so that we don't have to recognize that there are some things about us that are right. Yeah, I guess not perfect, right? Imperfect. And sometimes we don't have the right ideas. We don't necessarily see the world in a perspective that's as appropriate as other people, and so on. So yeah, and then obviously the third one, what we want to talk about is, well, what does a healthy relationship look like in terms of boundaries, both with ourselves, in terms of taking personal responsibility for how we think, feel, and our behaviors, what we do, and also then relinquishing the responsibility to other people and allowing them to think the way they think, feel the way they feel, and act the way that they act. And it's then the interplay, like the game that we play between me and you, right, and me and other, right, is what we then call a relationship, right? It's interrelating between those individuals, between those unique selves. So,
Yeah, and before we get to the healthy boundaries, right? I really want us to like think and reflect on our lives, right? And where we
mhm,
see those unhealthy boundaries, where we might
yeah,
identify in ourselves those
yeah,
low boundaries, right? And those rigid boundaries. And I want to ask you something. I sometimes notice, and I think we've had this conversation, I realized growing up, I also was not surrounded by any model of healthy boundaries. And
mm,
so a lot of people felt that they had a right to, tell me their opinion, right?
yeah,
And tell me what I should be doing and how I should be dressing and what I should be doing with my body. And
right,
sometimes, like, and I'm very empathetic as well, so sometimes I feel like I oscillate between having like low boundaries and taking on other, like, the responsibility for other people. But then when I feel like that I've been taken advantage of, or that it's too much, or I feel disrespected, I jump to the other side and get
yeah,
really rigid. And I'm just
right,
like, no, right? Like, I don't care, this is the way, I'm not going to change, right? It's like it, and
right.
that's quite unhealthy, right?
Right, and that's interesting because I mean, even there, like you've identified that as thinking that you're switching from one to the other, but yet both of those are a sign of the rigid boundaries, right? Because it's
Mm,
thinking that when the other person feels something, right, I have to change how they feel so that I can continue feeling okay. Right? So they're both of the examples you just shared are actually examples of rigid boundaries. Because if you're taking on responsibility for the other person, right, and you're wanting to change how they feel, right, a lot of the time that's so that you feel okay, rather than the non-existent boundaries would be you actually allow yourself to feel how the other person feels. Right? So if they get angry, you get angry. Right? Rather
okay.
than you saying like the other person's grumpy, right? And you kind of tell them, oh, you should cheer up because I'm happy right now, and right? And that's more of a rigid boundary.
Interesting. Well, I just learned something about myself right now.
Yeah.
Live. Cool, cool.
Yeah.
Cool. So to kind
So
of like, finish up the why. This is important, right? Because I think,
yeah, right.
before we get more into like the what, it's that self-identity and that having that
Yeah,
healthy sense of self, right? That focus of like who you are, what you want for your life, not in a rigid way, but having that clarity, right?
right. Yeah.
So that it's
And
not enmeshed. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Because I mean, one of the benefits are you create a self, right? When you have healthy boundaries, you know, and this is the simple idea. It's you know where you end and where somebody else begins, right? And where they end and where you begin. And of course, there's not necessarily anything physical all the time, right? Because often it's emotional, it's verbal, it's, well, I think that and you think this, right? And that's not clear to understand. Like it's an invisible force, right? Separating me and you in that respect. Obviously, the physical ones are easy. It's like you have your own personal space and you're like, hey, don't stand too close, right? And that's an easy one to understand. That when somebody walks up to you and speaking too close and you're like, get away, right? That's a physical boundary. It's really easy to understand. You're like, you're encroaching my personal space, right? So we can separate that. But the other ones are not so clear, right? Whether it be a sexual boundary in relationships, in terms of, well, my partner wants to do this, but I'm not so sure if I want to, right? Where do we make that distinction between what's okay for me and what I'm willing to try for the other person, or if I'm allowing myself to be, if you like, not have healthy boundaries, right? And actually just go with the flow of what he wants or what they want or what she wants, right? And then experience something that actually wasn't necessarily okay for me.
Mm,
And this is a lot of what happens within this kind of victim abuser situation, is that both people are responsible in some cases, that one is the abuser and is crossing the boundaries of the other, and the victim isn't necessarily being very clear on what they're okay with and what they want and communicating that and standing up for that, that
mm.
then they almost not allow the person to cross their boundaries, but in some cases that can happen. And I want to segue, there are times, of course, where the abuser is just doesn't care whatsoever about what the victim is experiencing and just does it anyway. So segue from that. But most of the cases in healthy relationships, or at least kind of monogamous relationships within couples and so on, a lot of the time where we're feeling like a victim, a lot of the time is that we may not feel comfortable sharing what's okay for us. And maybe it's out of fear that, yeah, of repercussions of having an argument or having to conflict with the other person that we don't agree with. But yeah, there's that side of things. So
Yeah, and I wanted to just make a quick note on that, to get the people listening a little familiar in understanding the triad, right? Because we have done emotions, we're doing boundaries, and we'll be doing needs the
yes.
next live session. And just so you guys understand, imagine with the example of the sexual experience, right? Um, how do you know where to place your boundary? Like, how do you know what you're comfortable with and what you're not, and where you're going to draw the line for yourself, even before having a conversation with somebody else, right? And for that, well, you actually have to think, okay, what do I need right now? And it is your emotions, right? If you feel scared or unsafe, right? Or like fearful in front of your partner, that's an indication of something to you, right? And it makes you think, okay,
Mm-hmm.
what is it that I need? Well, you know what? Right now I need to feel safe, right? So then maybe we create a safe word so that I have that
Mm-hmm.
backup, right? In case I start
Yeah.
crossing that boundary,
Yeah.
right? And
And, and
I think
even
that's
and
an
even
interesting
the
example.
Yeah, and even in a more elaborate communication within that as well, because a lot of the time, like, we might be going into an experience that we feel a moment of discomfort. In that moment, it's a no. Right? It's like, oh, I don't want to go any further. I'm a bit scared. And often simply sharing that and communicating that vulnerability of saying, oh, I don't feel very comfortable right now, or this is a bit risky. If the other person is able to respect that and say, okay, yeah, how do you feel? Or what do you want to do? Right? That's okay. We can stop if you want. Right? And that kind of momentary acceptance and validation of that boundary is usually enough for the person to go, oh, okay, so I can stop if I want. Okay, all right, so then I'm okay to carry on because I know that I'm in control of myself and I can stop at any time. Right? I'm not getting pulled into something that would escalate into out of control and I don't know what's happening.
Exactly. And I think an example that we've discussed that happens with me, right, is like I think maybe I set this boundary because of so many people overstepping it. I decided one day I was going to stop drinking. And it was for
Right.
me and my own health, but it was like I made it kind of official, like I don't drink, because that boundary was very clear for people. And I was so tired my whole life of people like pushing me to drink. Even when I
Mm,
said no once, twice, oh, come on, one drink. Oh, let's have fun. Let's dance. And I don't need alcohol to have fun, to dance, to be crazy, to do anything. And
right.
they kept like enforcing that, and it kept getting me really angry, and just
Right.
more rigid in that boundary. But if
Yeah.
somebody offers me a drink and I'm like, no thanks, and they're totally okay, don't even react, cool, they're like, do you want a tea? Then
Yeah.
I actually get a little bit more open to maybe having that drink. Because I'm
Right.
like, okay, they're
That's it.
respecting me, they're respecting the way that I am and my boundary.
Yeah.
Maybe I don't mind having a glass of wine.
Right.
So
That's
it's
it.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's that interplay of realizing that once you are clear with yourself, right, that you've got healthy boundaries and you can decide for yourself what happens, then you can play with that a little bit more and you feel more comfortable to explore and to experiment and so on. And that's the case with all parts of life, whether it be going into business, going into a relationship, going into, yeah, friendships. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's all like, the more comfortable you feel within yourself, the more happy you are to take on risks and try things because you know that you're okay.
Oh, exactly, exactly. And
Yeah.
so you mentioned one type right now, right? The sexual boundaries, but
Yeah.
there are a few types that we want to mention, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's at least 8 that come offhand quite easily, but I would say the first ones we want to talk about is this intellectual idea, right? Is that you don't have to think the way that I think, right? And I don't force my thoughts on you or tell you you're wrong for thinking the way you think, right? Now, it's not to say that you can't have a difference of opinion, and maybe I don't think your opinion is worthy, right? Let's say you know nothing about neuroscience or surgery, right? And then you have opinion about someone's surgery, right? That's not to say that one opinion is not more valid than the other, right? Because obviously sometimes it is. But the fact that you get to have a thought is unique to you, right? Because your ability to think through things needs to have that counter argument in your own head. And so a healthy person who thinks, right, thinks of one side and then thinks of a counter argument, and they kind of battle out in your mind, and then you come up with your opinion. Right? And of course, when you're influenced by other people and you get new information, your thoughts continue with that, and your opinions shift and change depending on the new information. So that ability to think is crucial. So if you share a thought and then someone else says, "Oh, stupid, you shouldn't, I don't think like that," right? Or you say, "I hate my mum," right? And you don't think like that, then no, I do, right? In this moment, that's what I'm thinking, and that's okay. Right? So the first one is definitely this intellectual idea that we're able to think differently to someone else, right? From moment to moment.
And what else do you think people might say, like unconsciously without wanting to, right? That kind of crosses a person's intellectual boundary and makes people maybe feel bad, right? Or
Yeah. Yeah.
what
Well,
else do we say?
one of the early ones, certainly that I can remember is that we got told not to think things, right? So a funny example maybe is like your mum tells you off for something, right? And then you look at her and you look at the box of cookies or whatever, right? And she goes, "Don't you even think about it." Right? And it's like, oh, okay. So it's like, but that's a crossing of a boundary, right? In many respects, because it's okay for the child to think about it. Right? It's okay for us to have a thought and to think of something crazy, right? You just imagine how crazy our dreams are, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes we have all kinds of extravagant things happening and we do things that we would never do in real life. And yet these thoughts, this imagination, right, is healthy, because without that, without the imagination, we have to live out the thing to find out the consequence. Right? So the beauty of having thought is that we get to have the thought, like our avatar in our head, play out something, and then we can see the consequence and say, "Oh no, that was a bad idea. I won't do
Mm.
that." Right? So we can have that thought.
So, and that's interesting because when we're younger and we're told not to think things, or we feel we're shamed, right?
Yeah,
Not because of
yeah,
thinking something, that creates a sense of shame for ourselves and around our thoughts, right?
yeah. And this is the underlying emotion which actually causes a lot of issues with boundaries, is that we
Mm,
get shamed for having that difference between us and someone else.
mm,
And this is most common between families, and they don't do it intentionally. My parents did it all the time unintentionally without realizing they were doing it. But they shamed me for having a different opinion to them about something. Right? And it can be as simple as maybe a religious belief. Right? Is that maybe the parents want, or they follow a certain religion, and the child questions it and goes, but what about this? Right? Which is just the thought, right? Questioning the kind of fundamental ideas of it, right? Which is healthy. You want to question things, like, as I said, you've got to have those two opposing views in your head to question what's right, and then you come up with a conclusion for yourself, and that's what we call our opinion. Right? So we've got to have that. And if the parent is saying, "Don't question this," or "Don't question that," or "My authority is ending," right? You can't question it. It's like, oh no, that's not healthy. And then we shame our own personal, yeah, I would say compass, right, of working out what's right or wrong for us, or what's true, right?
Yeah, this is really, we said we wouldn't get into the beliefs one much,
Yeah,
but
too
I think
much. Yeah,
it is interesting. That's one of the other categories of boundaries, right? Like beliefs, and there's the spiritual beliefs realm, which I think is an interesting one when it comes to families, right? Because what you just said, how many people have experienced this being told what they have to think rather than being taught how to think, right? Because
yeah,
if we were taught growing up how to think, then we would think, okay, what feels right for me, what are my values, what is going to
yeah,
make my life worth it. But rather, right, because of what we've been talking about, our parents, our society tries to like force how they think onto us, right? And
yeah,
anything that deviates from that is shamed. So then having healthy boundaries becomes like a challenge in the world, right? Because
yeah,
we have to fight for them rather than our parents, or our educational, our teachers respecting that and being like, oh wow, okay, you're different, right? And that
right,
can mean things like, wow, even though we are fiercely Catholic and you choose not to be, actually what healthy boundaries looks like is my parent accepting that of
hmm,
me, because I have the right to think, feel, and believe what I want to think,
right,
feel, or believe. And
right.
we can have conversations around it, right? But I do have that right within myself. And that's why I think this conversation is so damn important. you know?
Yeah. And the risks are great, right? If you don't have that like ability to think critically, right? We fall into a belief system which we haven't really questioned, we haven't really thought
Mm-hmm.
out, right? So we can get, and one side of this is kind of an ideological idea, right? Is you fix onto an idea, right? And you live out that idea, and you believe that idea, and you question that, you get aggressive towards other people if they don't believe what you believe, or you don't think the way you think, but actually you haven't necessarily stopped and thought it through yourself. Like that was just imposed on you, or you were told it and you just fully accepted it without questioning. And
Yeah.
so this inability to question things means we really can go in some horrible directions. Right? We
Yeah.
see this in political correctness. Right? This idea that you have to say a certain thing. Right? You can't say some words, right? And it's other people who get to decide what's okay and what's not okay to say, rather than allowing yourself to explore the nuances, the complexity, the context of the situation about whether what's okay to say and what's not okay to say. Right? There are some words that we say, oh no, you can never say those, but in some contexts, it's maybe appropriate. And that's really helpful if you can actually have that interplay in your head rather than being told strict, rigid rules of what can and can't be done. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And so that leads, we've talked about unhealthy boundaries, but yeah,
Mm.
we haven't yet actually given an example of what a
Yeah.
healthy boundary might look like,
Right.
right? And I loved this. Like this was a revelation for me because a boundary like that, a synonym of boundary can be like a limit or a line, right?
Yeah.
It sounds like a rigid thing, right? Like even in the banner we used, it said like a little sign in the back that said no trespassing, right? Just because it
Right.
represents that no boundaries. But what I love the most is that healthy boundaries are meant to be flexible. And
Right.
this is the beauty of, like we were saying, of everybody being their own individual selves, right? And thus having conversations and saying, hey, this is what I feel, this is what I need, how about you? Oh, this is what I feel, this is what I need. And we can bounce off each other, learn from each other. And if I have a boundary here, like for example, I don't know, I'm going to give one that is semi-real. I hate all drugs, right? I do not
Right.
do any drugs or tobacco. But then
Mm-hmm.
maybe with the right information and with the right person, right,
Mm-hmm.
I might become a little flexible and say, hey, well, you know what, actually, this information sounds right. I would feel safe in this circumstance to maybe try this um, once. And my boundaries
Right.
start to become a little more flexible. And that's what healthy looks like, right?
Yeah, well, and we actually talked about this the other day, right? This idea that I mean, I was somebody who grew up very much saying no to that, right? And I'm not sure why. I mean, there was a certain element of my parents telling me that that was bad, right? So I obviously just took on their belief of that. Even though I was a bit of a rebel growing up, there was still this side of me that was like, I wanted to be the good boy and I wouldn't do that, right? And but there was also an element that I didn't trust myself, right, to be able to determine and be okay in those situations and know what was enough and what was too far. So there was an element of lack of trust, of not having developed that healthy boundary for myself.
Mhm.
And later in life, we now get to the point where we're like, okay, now I've got healthy boundaries. Like now I know how to say no. Right? And that's probably the major thing that happens when you're 2 years old, right? Is you get to that point where you realize there's a difference between mum and me. Right? And we learn to say no, right? Even if it's something we want, we just try it out. It's like, do you want some food? No, right? And we learn that boundary of that it's okay for me to say no, right? And have a difference and decide yes or no for myself, right? And obviously, a healthy family encourages that boundary in our children, even if it's wrong in the moment. It's like the kid says no to food, and you're like, okay, well then no food, that's all right. Right? And then 2 hours later, they're hungry and they want food. It's like, okay, well, there you go, you learned something, right? And it's helpful, right? But and obviously there's limits to that too. Sometimes you have to say, no, come on, it's dinner time, we're going to eat now. So there's definitely this interplay of us developing healthy boundaries to then trust ourselves to know when to say yes and when to say no as we go to experiences. And now later in life, maybe you're more willing to try things, take more risks, and have different experiences because you trust yourself more. So yeah,
That's a tricky one, and I do want to kind of put these tricky situations on the table. Like,
yeah,
what do you do? And in the case of a child, it's maybe more difficult or easier because it's so obvious. But yeah, when you really think, because you might be wrong, but you really think you know what is best for that person, which of course everybody knows what's best for themselves. But, imagine, and it can be something like, again, with a child, like, hey, don't eat this, right? Don't eat this candy. If you eat this whole box of chocolates, your stomach is going to hurt, for example, right?
Mm,
And the kid's like,
right.
no, I want to have my box of chocolates. Like, where's the line between, yeah, what you let be and you let learn, and where you kind of like hold up your boundaries as a parent? What do
Yeah.
you think about that?
Yeah. So you've got two things come to mind in that. It's like, what's our goal as a parent? Right? What do we want to achieve? Basically, we're wanting to bring this child up, raise this child to a point where they no longer need us. Right? So we have to go from a state of complete dependency, right, as a newborn baby, completely dependent on us, to an 18-year-old who is independent and can leave and doesn't require us anymore. Right? Not to the extent that they can learn, right, as they go through. So we've got to basically slowly let go of that need to provide them straight away with what they need, and instead help them to discover what it is they need. So I would say in that one is you want to build up this idea of the child understanding whether they can handle the consequences of making the decision. Right? So let's say a kid's going to cross the road, right? And he just runs out into the road, right? You can say, well, okay, can the kid handle that situation if they make a bad choice? And maybe no. Right? In which case, then you grab the child and you say, hey, no, don't cross the road. There's cars coming. Right? You have to
Mm,
learn this, right? And you explain the consequences of what would happen. And the child goes, oh, right. Okay, yeah, I would die if I did that. So I'm learning that lesson very quickly. So there's that element of sometimes you have to cross a boundary, right, to inform them and let them know. And this is kind of socialization as well. As the idea of sometimes you have to say, no, don't do that. No, don't kick me. Don't bite me. Don't do these things because you're crossing my boundaries. So you're
mm,
teaching boundaries in that respect. But yeah, there's definitely an idea of, and that's what I like to think of, like asking the child, can you handle the consequences of the decision? Right? And if yes, go ahead, try it. Right? Try it and you'll learn your lesson. Right? Right? Climb that climbing frame. And if you fall off and you hurt yourself, well, okay, you learned a lesson, right? You grew from that. Right? But if it's a consequence of that's too great, then you say, okay, well, if you can't handle the consequence, then let's explore that together. Let's work on that together so you can find out what's okay and what's not okay. So that's what I would say is a healthy respect for their boundaries, and yet also, yeah, not causing like lifelong harm by allowing them through neglect, ultimately.
That's interesting. Another interesting one as well, like similar, is imagine a couple, all right? And the couple might have their own money and shared money, right? And so imagine that your partner comes to you and is like, hey, I would like to invest in this thing, right? And it can
Mm-hmm.
be a house, a course, a computer, right? A TV, whatever that may be. And, well, obviously, if the money is theirs, right, you're supposed to respect that. At the same
Yeah.
time, right, the consequences of that person losing that money, right? Imagine it's an investment, and I've known couples that have actually been through this before.
Yeah.
The consequences of them losing that money would have a huge impact on the family and on the other partner as well,
Mm.
right? So I love this idea of thinking of the consequences, because
Right.
I think it's major in terms of knowing where to let go and where to pick your battles, because I think that's what it's about, knowing which battles
Right.
to fight, right?
Right. That's it. And obviously it goes from a big deal like that of like investing your life savings to the small thing of like, I want to buy this microwave, right?
Mm,
And you may not like it and you may not agree with it, but yet sometimes you have to go, okay, well, right, it's your money, you want that. Okay, it's not my place to stop you. I can share my opinion and say, well, okay, I don't necessarily like that one, or I don't think that's a good one, but hey, if that's what you want to get, that's what you want to get. And that's
yeah.
that healthy side of being able to communicate and share like what you're okay with and what you're not okay with, and then both people then make a decision, right, within that relationship.
Yeah, that's great, because I do know people, and I have been this person, right, that give their opinion, but then secretly get like annoyed or angry if you don't do the thing that right, that they just shared.
Right.
Like they might say, "Oh, listen, well, I disagree, but do whatever you want. And then when they actually go do whatever they want and it's the opposite of what you said, you get kind of like,
Yeah. Well, and this happens so often with friends, right? Who call you up and complain about things, and we give them an idea, and we say, well, do this, and they never do it. And you're like, well, stop telling me about it, because you never do what I tell you to do anyway. Yeah. And that's not necessarily understanding that it's okay for them to live their life, right? And they're taking your opinion, your idea, and they're making their own decision. Yeah.
Yeah. It is really freeing though, actually, when you stop taking, even with the empathy, and we talked about this being there for a friend, right? You don't have to solve their life, you don't have to give them advice, you don't have to take responsibility for their problem. You
Yeah.
can share your opinion or you cannot and just be there and listen, but it is freeing when you just realize, you know what, let everybody do whatever they want. And it doesn't, I'm not going to take it personally. I think
Yeah.
that's a lot what respecting boundaries feels like, right? You
Yeah.
don't take things personally
Right.
because you don't think that everything everyone does has to do with you. They're
Well,
just,
this is this idea, because that would be a rigid boundary, right? In saying that what I think or believe is right. So if you do something different to how I'm doing it, then that makes me wrong, right? So we have to fight and tell the other person that you have to do it this way. This is the right way. And then, of course, right, and that's just to maintain and to hide from the shame that maybe we're wrong, right? Because
mm,
obviously when we do things that are wrong, we experience shame, right? And that's what helps us to alter and change our opinion and come to terms, right? Other people criticize us and show us that we're wrong, and we update our view, our opinion, right? And this is the social idea of like each individual is useless, right? In many respects, like we need other people to socialize us, to help us and keep us on the straight and narrow. And it's through the opinions of everyone else that we kind of understand that. And yet it's also, we need to defend ourselves from some things that may be too extreme, right? So
yeah.
hence, yeah, we have to learn to say no to some things. And like, okay, well, that opinion I'm not going to necessarily pay attention to, but these 5 or these 10, which seem quite reasonable, right, that's something that I will take on and learn from. Yeah.
Absolutely. And surprisingly, Matt, we actually have to start wrapping up. All right.
Right.
Yeah, so I actually, because some people are asking, and before we dive in, because we did want to give more examples, I just want to say the different types, like all of them out loud. All right. So we
Yeah.
have the intellectual, we have the
Yeah.
emotional, which is one I think we should
Emotional.
get
You
into.
get to feel what you want to feel, and
Yeah,
so
but
do
before,
they.
I'm just gonna say the list
Yeah.
before we dive in. So
Go for it.
intellectual, because they're asking for it. Emotional, physical. The sexual kind
Yes.
of goes into the physical.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's the actions, beliefs, and material, right? The
Yeah.
money one we
Yeah.
just talked
Material
about goes
boundaries.
into the
Yeah.
material one, for example, right?
Yeah. And the one that overarches all of them would be personal responsibility, right? Is that we have to look after ourselves. We can't put our needs on other people, right? And
Yeah.
they can't put their needs on us. Right? And obviously some exceptions like children and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big one, huh? Because
Yeah.
how many times do we just expect other people to fulfill our needs and then get kind of pissed off or annoyed or
Pissed off when
frustrated
they
if they
don't.
don't?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you
Yes.
guys can see that in yourself, yeah, now's the
Yeah.
moment to set up some boundaries. So, and what about the emotional ones? Because I think that's a big one, right? What
Yeah.
do emotional boundaries look like?
Look like, right. And the basic one is saying, well, it's okay for me to feel what I feel. And it's okay for someone else to feel what they feel. And those things don't have to be the same, which means we can have a different perspective, right? Because you and I can be looking at the same thing and experience it very differently. You might feel joyous and it maybe reminds you of a childhood memory and it's fun. Right? And for me, it might remind me of something that I heard which was really bad, and I might not like it and dislike it and feel a different emotion. So hence, it's okay for us to have those different perspectives. It's okay for us to feel different things. Right? It's okay for you to dislike broccoli, and it's okay for me to love it. Right? And that's very much a feeling of enjoyment or disgust. Right? So that emotional difference is okay, and we need to be able to separate that. And I used the example before of like, I remember my childhood. I had an argument with my granny, right? And I was outside and really upset. I said, I hate her. Right? And my mum says, you don't hate her. You can't hate her. It's not okay. Right? And she almost shamed me for hating her. And yet emotion is a temporary experience. It's not that I'm saying, okay, well, I hate her and I don't value my grandmother at all for anything. Right? It's in that moment I experienced that experience. Right? I had that emotional experience, and that's always okay. And I want to make a a distinction, that it doesn't mean that what I feel is fact, right? Because we can,
Mm-hmm.
this is the difference we talked about last week, right? The idea of emotions and feelings, right? The emotion is true because it's your experience, but your feeling of being rejected or being abandoned or being disrespected, right? Those are feelings, not emotions. So yeah,
Yeah.
so our emotional experience is okay for us to always have that, right? That's a boundary. Like our experience is individual to me. No one makes me feel anything, and I can't make anyone else. I can have an influence and I can try, right? But ultimately it's me who decides how I feel. And yeah, so that's definitely the emotional side of the boundary.
Yeah, and that's so crucial. Um, oh my goodness, like having those lines, like because what we talked about in the last time, and that's why they enmesh. And guys, every time we talk about boundaries, emotions will come up, needs will come up. Okay, so this is the
Yeah.
usual thing when you hear us talk. Um, it's when you say, yeah, I think a really important thing here with boundaries, so that we don't feel that they're just separating us from each other, right? Is that
Mm-hmm.
despite me having my boundaries and my sense of self, right? With my intellect and my emotions and my physical space and my sexual preferences and my beliefs, right? And all of that,
Right.
and you having all of those as well, is what I think what brings us together, right? Is that listening, that empathy, and that acknowledging of the
Mm-hmm.
other person's, right?
So, yeah, a healthy example of emotional boundaries would be that you allow yourself and you're able to empathize with somebody else. So maybe someone else is crying and they feel sad, and you're able to empathize, which means you're able to connect with that emotion and understand what it is that they're feeling, but not be enmeshed in that you actually kind of lose yourself in that experience at the same time. Right? So they
Yeah.
feel sad and they're crying, and then you lose yourself and cry and get all emotional, and like maybe you don't like it, so you try to stop them from feeling it. Right? And that's what happens when you're not healthy in that boundary. So a healthy boundary is you can empathize, you can connect with them, understand what they feel, you can show them some kindness maybe, and yet be okay yourself. Right? And have maybe joy and have an experience of feeling good about yourself for helping the other person. Maybe you can have a very different experience than what they are, and that would be an example of a healthy boundary. Yeah.
Yeah, and I like that a lot because in a book that I was looking at recently, I love that this doctor, he talked about empathy as a personality trait, but also as a
Mm,
skill that you can develop, right? And maybe
yeah.
people that are naturally empathetic as a personality trait might not have the healthiest boundaries, right? And might like lose themselves with the person, but actually empathy, the
Right.
skill, right,
Yeah.
looks like, yeah, I can connect with your experience, I can imagine, right, what it must feel like, I can maybe even,
So yeah,
yeah, but
something just came up.
what,
And this idea that quite often this idea of someone who's an empath or someone who doesn't feel, right, is quite often the distinction between healthy boundaries, right? In terms of it's the two opposite sides of an extreme. Right? If you are completely boundaryless, you only feel what other people feel, right? And you're constantly swayed in that direction. Like they feel something and you feel it, right? And then we call that quite often, I'm an empath, right? And
mm,
obviously I put myself in that category for a lot of time, right? Thinking that I was very sensitive, and I was. And then the opposite side is I'm rigid in my boundaries, right? Which means quite often I won't allow myself to look into what someone else feels, because what I feel is what I feel, right? And I'm a bit shut off from what other people feel. Right? And that's maybe that I've like shut down my emotions, right? And I'm
mm,
rigid in that sense that I don't want to experience an emotion. So yeah, you've got the two sides of being an empath, or like the somewhere on that scale, if you like, from being very empathic to not at all. And a lot of that is caused by, you know, not having healthy boundaries demonstrated to us, and for us to have developed that experience of empathy.
yeah, definitely. So to close up and then, open it to any questions that anybody might have,
Sure.
let's see, like, how can we begin to start on, connecting with that sense of self and
Yes.
where I might need to put some boundaries.
Yeah. So one of the major areas is for us to be okay with anger, right? Because
Mm,
anger is what enables us to be able to say no. Right? And obviously, that's why we see 2-year-olds being quite aggressive. They're the most aggressive of the ages, right? The most violent quite often. They bite and scream and scratch and hit and punch, right? And that's because they're trying to develop this emotional of anger and say no. And that's a healthy thing to do. And obviously we have to be socialized through that to make sure we don't cross any consequences that we can handle. But we have to develop that ability to listen to our anger and respond, not from it, but respond with it, right? To be able to say, okay, right, I'm feeling angry about this. I'm not happy with it. I don't want to do that. I'm going to say no, right? Without justification. Because often people with no boundaries, they don't feel it's okay to be angry. They don't feel it's okay to say no, because their reasons aren't justified. Right? And sometimes we over justify things. We say no, and it's like, oh, because of this and that and this, and we try to explain why all the time. And we don't always have to do that. Sometimes it's just okay for us to say no, I don't want to do that. A friend invites you over for dinner, right? And you just say, oh no, thank you, and that's it. Rather than, oh, I
Wow.
can't, I'm ever so sorry, I've got this thing on tonight and tomorrow I need to be well. And we give a really elaborate reasons, right?
That used to be me.
Justification.
Yeah.
I think we've all done it. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
like we can't say no. We're already thinking of all the reasons and what we're going to hold on to before we even
yeah,
say no. And if we can't find a good one,
right.
we're like, ah, let me just go.
Yeah. Yeah. Like maybe a salesman, right, is selling you something and saying, hey, have you got time for a chat? No, thank you. Right? And you just say no and carry on, right? And you have to be able to connect with that ability of strength, right? To be able to defend yourself in some respects, to be able to say no. So one thing is to connect with your anger and to be okay with your anger. And obviously that goes into the emotional element of what we talked about last week a little bit. But yeah, saying no, right, is the first thing that we do, right? And I would say listening to you, right? And this comes into our needs, right? Which we'll go into in our next session, right? Is being able to touch into what you feel like you need in that moment to enable you to say yes or no, right? And obviously it's not binary, right? There are lots of gray in that, but basically it's like, what's okay for me, what's not okay for me, what's a yes and what's a no. And the way we understand that is by listening to ourselves, our thoughts, our opinions, our values, and what we feel from moment to moment. So connecting more with our body. And I would say the tactic, if you like, or something you can develop here, is to give your opinion or your thought first. Right? So let's say you're in a group of friends and someone asks a question to the group, right? To help you develop your boundary would be to share your opinion first, rather than allowing other people to share what they think. And then you'd be like, oh yeah, I like what they said. And, oh yeah, I agree, right? And there we don't really develop ourselves, right? Because we're just agreeing with other people. While if we share our opinion first, right, we get to have an idea and we get to share that. And it's like, well, this is what I think. It might be wrong, right? It may not be very good. And that's irrelevant at this point. I'm just saying, hey, this is what I think. This is what comes to mind straight away, right? And then obviously we can adjust ourselves. But yeah, saying something first. Your partner says, well, what movie do you want to watch? You give them an answer rather than saying, oh, I don't know. What do you want? No, give an answer. Right? Ask yourself, well, what movie do I want to watch? Right? Or what food do I want to eat? Right? Giving your opinion, giving your say, sharing your thoughts, right? Sharing what you feel.
And I love, I think it's really important to remember that in the healthy boundary, it is flexible, right? I think it's a key thing. So you can share your opinion, you can disagree with people, right?
Yeah,
Say
that's the big
what,
one.
yes, say no, say what you would like to do. That doesn't mean that you are rigid in that, right? The other person can, your friend can be like, no, listen, but the party's going to be amazing because I don't know who's going to be there. There's going to be a band, right? And you might, again, you're in your right to check in with yourself again and say, oh, how do I feel about this? Do I want to? No, I'm still okay. Thanks. Like, so your friend can keep trying, but that might mean like, oh, there's going to be this band. You know what? Maybe I will go.
Yeah.
It's that
Yeah.
natural play. It's not like, this is what I want and I'm sticking with what I want.
Yeah.
And perhaps, Matt, I don't know, when somebody is first developing their boundaries for the first time, what do you think? Do you think there might be like some initial rigidity just to try to get more familiar with holding on to that thing that they believe?
Well, let's say at the beginning it's going to be clumsy, right? Because if we've lived a long period of our life either having non-existent boundaries, which is like not really sharing our opinion, not listening to ourselves, and just kind of going with what other people want, or the other side of having very rigid boundaries and only ever doing what we want and never allowing ourselves to be open to other people's point of view and so on. So you've got two sides. So let's say you've got non-existent boundaries. You start saying no, right? You start disagreeing with people and allowing yourself to have that difference of opinion and say, okay, well then let's agree to disagree, right? So that would be that side of things. And if you're a little bit more rigid, then it'd be a case of saying, okay, well, how about you don't take yourself so seriously in terms of right and wrong, yes, like yes or no, right? Meaning that what you think has to be so, right? So just open yourselves up to this possibility that there might be value in what the other person says, thinks, right? That they might have an opinion or have a view on the world which is maybe valuable, right? And you can take on some of that. And that doesn't mean that you're a bad person, doesn't mean you're a shameful person for allowing that to happen. Right? So taking in that side of things, so allowing your boundaries to be a bit more flexible, to say, all right, okay, I thought that, and now I've adjusted a little bit, and yeah, okay, now I listen to that opinion. That's okay now. So that would be the two sides. Is if you're low in boundaries, you say no and you disagree, and if you're rigid in your boundaries, right, you listen a little bit more. Right, you hear what the other person thinks. You develop a little bit more empathy in saying, okay, well, okay, you think that. Let me allow myself to question that, rather than just rigidly saying no, without contemplating it, without thinking it through.
Mm.
So yeah,
Man,
allowing someone
I'm
else to
having
influence you a little bit.
I'm having a little revelation. I actually like we've talked about this so many times, but I actually think I have much more rigid boundaries than I thought.
Cool.
Yeah,
Good to
yeah,
know, right? Good to
yeah.
know. And that's
Good
a
to
really
know.
beautiful point to come to, is to say, oh, right, okay. Yeah, now I know which direction to help myself move in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, cool. So I'm going to cut us off here, not engage in any more conversation because
Yeah.
I think we
We
really
could go on
did
for hours. Yeah.
exactly, but I think we did cover, the basics of boundaries. I'm going to do a super quick recap.
Yeah.
And guys, please write any questions, doubts that you want us to answer here live. All right, this is definitely the moment. Okay. But to recap, well, we talked about like why boundaries are important. Well, first of all, boundaries are critical for creating that sense of self. All right.
Yeah.
Boundaries help you create your self identity, that healthy sense of self esteem.
Yeah.
Also, to have healthy, functional relationships with somebody else. They allow you to focus and understand your own life, your goals, your own values, right, and get in touch with them and live a life that align with them rather than a life that is not yours, right, which is what a lot of people are doing. And yeah,
Yeah.
and it helps us not enmesh or over identify with other
With
people
others. Mm-hmm.
or things. Exactly. So we talked a little bit about, polar opposites of that, what that might look like the abuse and victim relationship could be an example
Yeah.
um, of,
Yeah.
of, of those having really rigid boundaries and having
Yeah.
really low boundaries, right? Which both
Yeah.
are unhealthy. And what healthy
Yeah.
looks like is that this is who I am, this is what I want, but I am okay to be influenced if I let myself, right?
Right.
According to what I
Yeah.
think is right at any given
And
moment.
and that ability comes from knowing that you can say no.
Exactly, exactly. So
Yeah.
feeling that sense that you can always say no at any, or yes, of course, yes or no at any
Yeah.
given
Exactly.
time is your right, and you do not have to justify it. All right, that's so important.
Yeah.
I think I know
Yeah.
for me that's been really hard. I'm sure for a lot of people listening as well. It's okay. You can always say no, and it's not your responsibility to handle how the other person will feel. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
lastly, and we'll take on the questions, the types of boundaries we discussed, all right, were the intellectual, emotional, and physical, which all kind of fall into this personal responsibility category. And then, we have the sexual, the actions, beliefs, and material boundaries, all right? And
Yeah.
last thing is how. We talked about how we can put those boundaries in place. But of course, listening and being in touch with your emotions and needs, all right, are a big one.
Yeah.
And you can start, sharing your thought first, as Matt said. listening to your own body, right? Whether it's the emotions or your own intuition of what you feel is right for yourself, making decisions for yourself rather than placing the
Mhm.
responsibility on another person's opinion, no matter how much, you care about their opinion. Start trusting yourself in the decisions that you make.
Yeah. Yeah. Develop
Disagree with
trust,
people.
because developing trust, you can't just have it. Right? You've got to develop trust, which means you make decisions and you make mistakes and you get things right, and you learn that you can handle making the mistakes, and you can handle and feel proud of yourself when you get it right. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. And accept that nobody has to think like you, and you don't have to think like anyone else,
Right.
and it's okay to be different and
Yeah.
disagree.
That's the fundamental thing, is the concept in your mind of realizing that I'm responsible for how I think, feel, and behave. They're responsible for how they think, feel, and behave. And that's always like okay to have that differentiation between the two. I'm not responsible for them. They're not responsible for me. I don't have to feel what they feel. Right. And it's that, then it's the interplay. Right. Once you understand that there's me and I end here and that's them and they start there, then we kind of work out what's okay. And we have that negotiation between those two boundaries, rather than either having none and being over empowered by the other one, or being rigid and having to overpower them. Right? So
Mm-hmm.
we have this power structure when you don't have healthy boundaries.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no,
A
absolutely.
bit like
No,
countries do, right? I mean, the thought comes to
yeah,
mind, right? It's like if you don't have a healthy border between countries, right, you either overpower and you cross over there, or you don't have it and you have like too much immigration or so on, and people come in. So you've got that physical boundary coming through. Yeah.
absolutely. Cool.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and answer the questions. We have a bit of them. So,
Yeah.
um, are we going to have another session to talk more about this? Is there a second session? So this is a second session of the triad, and we're going to have a third one about needs, which is interconnected with this, on May 3rd, right? So in 2 weeks' time.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right. And then,
And I would say that there is so much to explore around boundaries that we're going to have to create something. I don't know what it is, but we'll create something to, yeah, talk more about
yeah,
this and explore it more. Yeah.
no, exactly. Because we are coming up with, guys, on May 10th. We're doing um, like a curated group of an actual experience, all right, of maximum 15 people, of how to feel. All right. So it's
Yeah.
how to feel, the guided experience. Because I know talking about this is really interesting, but as both Matt and I know, who are coaches, the real juicy stuff happens when you actually apply this stuff to yourself. All
Yeah.
right. That's
Not
when the
just a theoretical
transformation.
knowledge, but an experiential knowing. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. So
Yeah.
these are the kind of experiences we'll start coming up with. We haven't come up with one for boundaries yet. All right. We're on the emotions still,
Yeah.
but again, they're connecting with your emotions is the first step, I would say. So
Yeah.
then you can go on and talk about boundaries and where you have to set those boundaries.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's go for another question. So how about if your boss said something and you can't really say no because it's your boss in the like
Yeah. Because that
hierarchical culture.
hierarchical. Yeah. Yeah. And obviously that's where we have to work out the consequences, right? Because we can't
Mm,
just tell our boss what we think, right? We're like, oh, I think you're an asshole and you don't know anything. And of course we've got to pay the consequences for that. And obviously a part of that is as well as understanding that structure of hierarchy is that maybe it's their company, right? And they get to decide like how it works, and they're employing us to do a certain job. And yet we always have the ability to say no, right? So, and this is quite often what happens in companies where there's a little bit of corruption going on, right? And there's something that maybe your boss has asked you to do something and you just don't agree with it. You're like, I just won't do that. Right? And maybe you'll have to pay consequences, but I think the consequences of not doing that might be worse than if you said no. Right? And this is the case because you can corrupt yourself, right? You can go down a direction where you're not happy and you end up somewhere where you don't know how to get out. Right? While sometimes early on you can say no and say, oh, I don't necessarily agree. I don't like that idea. Right? And then maybe there's a negotiation that happens. So it's complicated, right? Because obviously each situation is contextual. Right? I have to know what the situation is, what the boss thinks, what you think, and so on. But basically, you want to be able to have a healthy relationship with your boss that you can share your opinion. Because why are they hiring you otherwise if it's not for you to have an ability to be able to question and share your expertise?
Well, because sometimes it might just be to execute something, right? And I think a really important question to ask yourself with this is, if I don't say no, right, because I don't want to, right now, I don't want to deal with the consequences of saying no, which might be potentially getting fired, right? Something like that. Then what will the consequences be of how you feel about yourself? Can you
Mhm.
handle doing this thing that you actually prefer not to be doing or don't agree with? And how long can you handle it for? Because sometimes we do little sacrifices like, okay, I prefer not to, but okay. Okay, well, you know what, but okay, right? And we keep like kind of sacrificing little things we believe until one day we've lost ourselves. Like we're like,
Mhm.
who am I? And that happens in relationships, right? Like
Right.
I've sacrificed so much of what I believe and what I love and what I usually do and my values, that at some point you're like, who am I? Okay, so it is
Yeah.
important to do that check in with yourself, all right? Because,
Yeah.
but if you're okay, if this little thing that you actually is not that important for you, and you can keep doing this for another 3 months while you look for another job, or I don't know, right? Um,
Right.
then maybe it's not a battle you want to fight and you let it go,
Right.
right?
Pick your battles, right? This
Pick
is
your
a key
battles.
one. And that's maybe useful to discuss with other family members and friends and people you know, right? To
Yeah.
say, hey, am I being petty and silly? And I'm just saying, I just disagree with this because my boss wants me to do that and I don't want to do it. So I'm trying to say no. Or is it serious? Like, do I really say no to this? Is that something that I'm not willing to do? Is that crossing a strong value for me? And I should stand up for that. And I'll be proud of myself no matter what the consequence. Right.
Yeah.
So other people's opinions will help you to understand where you sit in that. Like, are you being serious? Is this an important topic, or is this petty and silly and I should just let it go?
Oh, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think values are key here as well for understanding
Yeah.
boundaries and where to say no. So another question is the same: how do you handle a family member that repeatedly doesn't respect boundaries at all?
Right. And this is where it's challenging because that happens family and also in relationships. Right? And quite often early on in your childhood, right, your no ends up being a fight. Right? You end up crossing those boundaries and it becomes a physical fight that you have that with each other. And that's necessary in order for both people to understand, right, that because sometimes we have to argue, we have to disagree, we have to show the other person that we don't that we won't just allow ourselves to be, I won't just roll over to this, right? It's okay for me to have this disagreement. So sometimes we need to do that. And again, this is the idea of we have to figure out. So how do we deal with someone who is constantly crossing our boundaries? Is that if they're doing that, then in some ways we're allowing them to do it. Right? We're not willing to pay the consequence of standing up for ourselves. Right? And I think that's what we have to figure out. Say, okay, right, maybe for my self-respect and my own healthy boundaries, I need to learn to say no. Right? And maybe in order to do that, I need to put myself in a situation where I'm not dependent on them. Because this is what happens if it's your parent. Right? If you're a kid, if you're 10 years old and you want to really say no to your parents, you're dependent on them. Right? So to a certain extent, it's very difficult to challenge that and stand up to that because you need them. Right? And you can't replace them. And that's the point. You're stuck with them. Right? That's all you've got. So, and that's why it's very difficult for children to maintain healthy boundaries with a parent who constantly doesn't respect that. So, one is get yourself to a point where you don't have to be dependent. Right? Become independent as much as possible from that perpetrator. So then you can say no and handle the consequences. That's probably the first thing that.
Exactly. And that requires building a trust within yourself to know that it's going to be okay. I
Yeah.
think I don't want to get into this. I just want to throw this comment in there, but sometimes with family or with people, we're scared of saying no because we don't want to disappoint, and we're scared that we're not going to be loved by them anymore, right? So ask
Right.
those questions as to why, right, you are letting that person cross those boundaries. All right.
Yeah.
Um, all right. So
And maybe just a little segue to say that anything we share here is not advice. We're not telling you what you should now go away and do. This is just simply ideas, expression. We're talking through, and yeah, you've got to use your own opinion, if you like, to decide what you're going to do.
absolutely. This is our
Yeah.
perspective on it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you take other boundaries and needs, like others' boundaries and needs, not personally? as
Mhm.
does like somebody says no and I take it personal.
Yeah, and that's maybe an example of the rigid boundary, right? Is that if they're saying no, then I have to question whether what I'm doing is right or not, right? And maybe we have to take it personally sometimes, right? Maybe that's okay that we take it personally, right? And that's maybe where we, like, if we get angry with that, and if we're not okay with that, and we're not okay with the other person saying no, then maybe we're a little bit averse and we're hiding away from shame, right? And maybe we need to be okay with that, with what we feel in those situations. And so obviously that goes back to the emotional intimacy side of things, of actually being okay with your experience when the other person says no. Right?
Yeah,
It's like, I want something and they say no. And it's like, oh, I'm disappointed, I'm sad, I'm maybe angry, and I need to be okay with those experiences, rather than saying, well, that's not okay that they said no. Right? They can't make me feel like this. Right? They didn't. You feel like that, and that's our responsibility to accept how we feel. Right? And then we begin a negotiation after that. Right? Because obviously we want to try to influence the other person, but we have to be okay that if they say no, if that's the ultimate decision. Yeah.
totally agree. Yeah, totally agree with
Yeah.
that 100%.
Mhm.
If you're with someone who has always put others first and said yes, like for example, I'm happy if they're happy, and you're still at the start of trying out saying no sometimes, what do you do with the guilty feelings that accompanies the no? I find that it builds up over time, even if the other person has respected the response, until it might bubble up and say later on, so we're talking about the feeling of guilt when you kind of start to say no because maybe you feel bad that you hurt that person, for example. That
Right.
is what I'm understanding.
So
And the
this,
feeling of,
yeah, so this is the idea that someone else is constantly having change. Is that one? You're talking about the
it's
one?
that long one.
Yeah. How do you deal with someone who is constantly changing boundaries? Or
No, on top, by Emmett. So if you're someone who always has put others first, so you're a person that has always said yes to everything, and
okay,
I'm
so
happy
yeah,
if
so
you're
we're
happy, and
someone who've always put others first,
yeah,
right?
and you
Okay, yeah,
start
so
placing
that's
boundaries, but you have guilt. How do you deal with the
right.
accumulating guilt of starting to say no?
Yeah, take it. Right, be okay, because that, the guilt is another word for shame, right? So they get interconnected a lot early on. When we don't have that emotional intimacy with ourselves, quite often we'll experience shame for saying no. Guilt is something slightly different. Guilt is when you're doing something and you know it's wrong, right? And that can be a little bit difficult to distinguish between the two, because if you feel shame for saying no, even though maybe everyone else would agree and say like, yeah, of course it's okay to say no, right? But you feel it like it's not okay. That's probably because you've been shamed for saying no early on in your life, right? And that's the experience of having a rigid family member who didn't allow us to have boundaries, right? And didn't help us develop healthy boundaries. So one thing would be, yeah, is develop the ability to be okay with the consequence, right? Which is feeling guilt, feeling shame, staying with that and riding that out, not giving into it. Right? Because if you're saying something, if it's something simple and you really know that actually, I mean, everyone else's opinion matches yours, and you're like, no, it's really okay for me to say no here, then maybe it's okay for us to develop the ability to handle that emotional experience and not cave in, not give in, just feel it and ride it out. Right, and obviously that's when we start to develop the ability to, yeah, to sit with our emotions. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the person did say that after, because the guilt bubbles up, they end up changing their answer to yes, and then the person gets confused. And I think it's
Right.
really important to get in touch with what's going on. What made you change your
Yeah.
mind? Was it your discomfort with that that emotion that you couldn't handle? You were so uncomfortable with it and judging it and shaming it that then you were like, okay, yes, just to make it go away, right? Well, I have no idea, right? This is where you're kind of
Yeah.
like exploring
Yeah.
is the most important part here. What's
Yeah.
going on inside you?
And that's something, certainly something that I've experienced a lot, right, growing up. Right? And I had fairly low boundaries, and I quite often put my partner first, or put other members of my family first. And it's like, are you okay taking the last piece of cake? Right? It's like you take it and then you feel guilty because you've taken the last piece of cake. But you have to be okay with realizing that you are equally as valuable as any other member around that table who could choose to have that bit of cake. Right? And maybe that's something that we can learn to develop, is to be the one now. Right? If you've never done that, if you're always putting someone else first, have a go. Like, take the last piece of cake, right? And just sit with it. Be okay with it, that you're valuable. Right? So that's maybe something we can play around with, is start small, right? Say no, disagree, right? And don't change it. Just allow it and let that realize that actually now, because especially as a kid, it wasn't okay, right? You would have been shamed, you would have been told off, you might have even been punished, right? So we learned that kind of helplessness as a kid. And as we grow up, we realize that actually now the consequences aren't anywhere near as great. The other person can disagree and get upset and angry, and yet we're okay. Nothing changes, right? Our life isn't at risk, right? And that's something that's really helpful for us to learn, that we're not that child anymore. Because if we feel that guilt and shame, and we are constantly changing our mind, we, in somewhere inside of us, we still feel like we're younger than we actually are, right? So actually we need to learn that actually we're an adult now, or we can stand up and say no, and we can handle ourselves, and we don't need that protection from the person who was saying that we had to. So yeah, that's something to play around with.
Cool. No, definitely. And last one, because I think this one we kind of answered already, is how do you deal with someone who has who's constantly changing boundaries? Like one day something is okay, but the next day it's not, or there's a different boundary for me than for them, etc.
Yeah. And maybe one thing is to realize that that's how boundaries are, right? And maybe let's use an example of something simple like chocolate cake. Right? Super simple. It's like, today I want chocolate cake, right? And I'm like, okay, I want chocolate cake. And tomorrow I've had enough chocolate cake, and now it's, no, I don't want chocolate cake. So this flexes and changes depending on my needs, depending on if I've met those needs or not, right? So maybe something's okay for me today, but it won't be tomorrow, right? And we have to be okay with that, right? And obviously, if the other person is very flip-floppy, it's pretty hard, right, for you to understand, right? And it is complex in relationships and so on. And sometimes we have to, right, play it out and realize that and respect that we're all different. So I mean, it's obviously hard to know because we need to know the context of each particular situation. But generally, if the other person is changing, right, they're trying to figure themselves out. Right? One day they think it's okay, and then they get scared and they don't feel safe. So then it's a no. Right? And maybe they don't feel that comfortable. Maybe they're insecure and they need to develop themselves, like their self-identity, right, to understand that. Or maybe it's simply that their needs are shifting from moment to moment, and that's okay. So it depends on the context of it. Like maybe like today I want to be in a relationship and tomorrow they leave me. It's like, whoa, holy shit. I mean, that's a huge one. Right? And that one you want to say, well, this person isn't necessarily very stable, and maybe I need to protect myself and have that boundary of my emotional self kind of respected. But if it's something small and it's like, well, like yesterday they were okay to kiss me and today they're not, then it's like, okay, well, maybe it's just that moment. Maybe 5 minutes later they'd be okay to kiss me, right? And we have to figure out what they need. So that's being attentive to the other person's needs from moment to moment.
Yeah. And I guess it's really important to ask yourself, like you said, right? What do I need? What is making me uncomfortable? To know what you're willing to tolerate and where your boundary, right, for tolerating something or staying with someone is. But yeah, it's a bit of exploring there as well. Like this whole thing is such an exploration, right? Of yourself, of the other, of asking different questions. Yeah.
Right. And that's part of that is, I would say, is realizing that the other person is not responsible to meet our needs, right? So we can ask it, we can make a question, right? And we can say, hey, look, I've got this need, would you like to meet it for me? Right? And if they say yes, then great, right? We feel good and we build intimacy and we feel close together.
But it is your job to communicate it.
Right, yeah, it's our job to communicate the need.
Because sometimes we just like, you know, and I think this happens a lot, we expect others just to know what we need.
Yeah.
And then we get kind of annoyed when they don't, but it's like you never expressed it, you never said it, or they said it in such an indirect way that you didn't really understand it, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
knowing how to express these needs, and this is what we'll talk about in the next session, in a way
Yeah.
that doesn't sound needy, right?
Right. Yeah. And yeah, we'll get into that next one. But yeah, definitely this idea that you have to be able to learn to ask and be okay whether they say yes or no. Right? That's respect their boundaries and understanding your own. And that comes from a knowledge that if they say no, you're responsible to meet it elsewhere. Right? So you say, hey, I need some comfort right now. Can you give me a hug? And they say, hey, no, not right now. It's like, okay, well then how can I comfort myself? Or how can I call a friend and get comfort from them? Where can I go?
Yeah, all
Right?
right, we're getting ahead of ourselves. That's our next session. All right, that's our next session.
So yes.
So cool. So guys, we're gonna close it up here. Thanks for your questions, your engagement. So glad you enjoyed getting some cool comments over here. Make sure to follow on Instagram and Facebook if you have it. Meetup, LinkedIn. We always post everything going on, and you can always book a free discovery call with Matt or I through the Self Club website. All right, which is theself.club. All right. So thank you for being here. Thanks so
Cool.
much, Matt.
Thanks, Sam. It was awesome chatting with you again.
Always great chatting
Yeah,
with you. See you
we'll
next
do it
time.
soon. See ya.
Bye, guys. Take care.
Ciao.